Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Kyle. You might have thought I died in 2020, and you'd be correct. This is my spirit.
And I'm Elliot, very much in the 2021 life, with my head down, holding tight for a week before I can hopefully get my vaccine. Whoop whoop.
I still don't know when I'm getting mine, so hopefully, fingers crossed, it won't be too long.
29th, baby.
Clayton, I understand that I've been gone for a while, but when did you start allowing juggalos on the podcast? Did Elliot just give a whoop whoop?
Hey man, I've got my Fago right here.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. And thank you for joining us. Today we are going to be doing another of our Dicebag Disco, our grab bag episodes where we don't have much structure and we just talk about whatever random topic we want to talk about that's none of us felt like was enough to dedicate an entire episode to. Kyle, thank you very much for joining us again. It seems like it's been a while since you've been here.
Yeah, I have no explanation. I have no. So I need to mute my damn phone. Look how fucking rusty I am. I have no explanation for you, other than, well, it's a shitty year, man. I don't know if anybody out there knew about anything happening last year, because it's not like literally every piece of media, commercial, corporation, grocery store, and gas station has a fucking announcement about unprecedented times. So now this one does too, I guess.
Well, you know, one thing I will say about the old Corona, I'll be glad to put it in the rear view. And 2020 was trash in almost every way, but one thing I can't say I'm glad for is that it pushed me back to the table for the first time in a long time. So hopefully, once we can play in person again, it'll just get better. But at least there's that.
So, thank you all for listening to us. Kyle, thank you for joining us. And if any of our previous hosts who haven't been with us in a while ever want to join us again, please don't hesitate to reach out and we'll make something happen, because I love being able to reconnect with you all, and I'm sure our listeners would enjoy hearing some of the voices we haven't heard in a while.
Yeah, man, it's good to hear from you, KP. It's been a minute.
I appreciate that. It's funny if the isolation of last year brought you back to the table, so to speak. Though I've not really quit role-playing. I have cut down on my number of campaigns pretty significantly. I've very much come to value my time spent role-playing. I was actually approaching burnout, I believe, and paring back on campaigns, and then, coming to value the ones the ones I'm still in more has been good for me in the hobby, I think.
Oh, that's good. Have you been playing in person?
No. All over Discord. Thank you, Discord Incorporated, for sponsoring this episode of Alien Familiar Media. No.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, that burnout that you mentioned, that's something that I struggle with. Elliot and I were just happened to be talking before the start of the podcast about how it's something that we all grapple with. So I think we're going to go ahead and start talking about how to deal with GM burnout, since we've organically gone in that direction. Burnout is something that I struggle with every time I run a long-term campaign. I get about, at best, 9 months into it before I just lose pretty much all will to continue, and I lose enthusiasm, I lose creativity, and more often than not, there is something else that I want to play that has come out, or there is some other idea that I've had that I want to try out, and it just saps everything that I ever had going into the campaign that I'm currently playing in. So I just want the game that I'm currently in to die so that I can do something different.
I'd like to know from KP, the forced, deceleration on gaming. How can you expound on that? How just limiting the amount of time. I mean, if you're the type of person that's at the table a lot and running a lot, how did just taking a little bit of a dial back reinvigorate you?
You mean like in what way did it work for me? Sort of.
Was it just becoming a player for a while?
I guess it's still on topic, but my burnout was a bit different. It wasn't just game master burnout, which I've absolutely experienced, and we can get back on that topic after I say my piece here. But the burnout I was experiencing was twofold. One, to be completely honest, it was standard Dungeons and Dragons burnout, and actually not even standard. It was D&D burnout, just wholesale. I've really struggled to find things to sink my teeth into in the kind of standard something for everyone, capitalist, modern, but still it's medieval universe of D&D. And I don't mean to shit on it. We've covered Dungeons and Dragons extensively on this podcast, but I just couldn't get into it. And so I don't quite know what changed. I think part of it actually is that I just started to value time, like quality time spent with people in those games, and that allowed me to just push past me being sick of D&D. And then also I discovered recently some like alternative fantasy things that have been good. And by alternative fantasy, I don't mean like tentacle porn. I mean didn't you guys miss me? I mean like I've been playing The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind recently, and I've been
Wow.
Yeah, like it's very dark. It's almost like it's like Dune met I don't know, Conan the Barbarian, and yeah, there's cool things to be had and done in fantasy, and wrapping my head around how D&D is just a template. You can put your own mind and universe into that. I kind of had to figure that out. And I had said this whole thing was twofold, and now I've rambled for like 5 minutes, but the other fold of the two is really just realizing the quality time spent with people in my games became extremely just valuable to me over the past few months.
I feel that 100% because I'm kind of living it on I'm from in the other direction. You're kind of reflecting on a break, kind of. It sounds like you've had, and me, I'm kind of on the tail end of in that getting into that burnout feel, and that's definitely what keeps me. That's definitely what keeps me getting back to the prep. Whenever I, do it, whenever I think about, gosh, do I really want to play this week? Do I really want to keep running the game? I mean, D&D, then I start going into I didn't like this and didn't like that about D&D. On the D&D thing, since you mentioned, I wanted to say that, whenever I started initially world building a long time ago, it was I really wanted to solve a lot of those issues, using barter economy instead of a coin economy, and, trying to really demonstrate what a medieval serfdom was like, and like urban, whenever players would go into urban areas, how different life would be. And I utterly failed. Those were the first ambitions that got thrown to the way, and looking back on it, wondering why. I think that part of D&D is just so ingrained. It's so baked in. And me and Clayton were talking about this earlier. It's like, when people just say, well, you can always, bring in a sub rule from like the DMG or go find a supplement. It's like, as a DM of D&D, it's like you either have to accept it with its flaws, or you just end up having to become your own game developer almost doing their job for them, and I found that to be overwhelming. So I feel similar. I know exactly what you mean by being caged by D&D's absurd anachronisms. They get on my nerves, but I don't know what to do about them either. But definitely bringing people together and playing together regularly, that was not something that I had in my life prior to, as far as gaming goes. When we shut down for COVID, I felt like had cultivated a pretty decent social life for the first time in a long time, having had two kids that were getting to later childhood. I started reconnecting with people, and then COVID happened and it just stopped. So that's definitely what keeps me coming back to the table. Is It's like, no, man, why? What? How would I see people without gaming in this day and age? So that's probably what is fighting my burnout the most. It's like I just don't want to lose that weekly hangout, even if it's a shitty game I put together. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that I know exactly what you mean. That's 69% of what kept me. I know, nice. Going was just swallowing the sugar pill of D&D in order to really just hang out with people who meant something to me. Who mean something to me. Yeah. I briefly, one more thing I just realized that has helped is, and this might get us back on track to DM or Game Master burnout. It really finding a character that you love playing can do wonders for any flavor of burnout. I think especially GM burnout. I have been playing in a Firefly game using the Cortex system. It's actually for some reason there's two different packages. One is for the Firefly TV series and one is for the Serenity, the movie. And so we're playing the Serenity system, but whatever. Anyway, the character in that game, for one thing, it's science fiction, which is more my bread and butter. But it's a character that I've enjoyed really getting into the head of. And it just so happens that I had decided to sort of challenge myself, but also it was a product of me just being kind of burnt out and uncertain. I had made some characters in some fantasy games that were just very antisocial, and when I'm already I'm a very social person normally, but I've been forced to become antisocial in real life, and I'm playing two antisocial characters in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition in two different games. It was just a recipe for burnout for me.
Yeah, something that you hit on a little bit ago was just recovering from GM burnout and talking about just being able to get into the groove of being a player again. That is probably the way that I recover from my GM burnout the best. And Elliot, thank you very much for running the Curse of Strahd game, because you are literally giving that to me. You've been giving that to me for the past several months since I joined your game. Just the ability to go into another character and just shoot the shit with your friends for a few hours, a few hours, one night a week. It keeps me in the hobby. If I didn't have this hobby, I would have so much free time that I would literally have nothing to do with it. And I play this game because I love it. I play it because I love getting into the character. I love creating. And when you're a GM, and especially if you're the only GM in a group, it's incredibly taxing to be the one who is creating that content, and being able to just play a player for a while really helps not only recharge your reserves by just giving you a more limited focus for your creativity, but it also expands your experience, because you are seeing somebody else run the game. You're seeing somebody else's techniques, their strengths and their flaws, and you're learning yourself from them as you are a player, just relaxing in the game, because players really don't have anywhere near as much responsibility as the DM has.
Well, to continue the love fest, I think the only reason why I I've been able to maintain just the game. For me, it's really long. Like I think that it seems like most you two, and I know Jordan, you've had this experience before. It's been so long since I ran a continuous game, and we've been going since what now, May? And to me, that's a crazy long time to run a game. I haven't ran a game like that. It's the longest I've ever ran. It's one of the longest I've played in. But you know, I don't know that I could. One thing that is a strength is that you can fight burnout simply by having really good players and players who are not only invested, but I mean, that account for your weaknesses. Like, I know I wouldn't have been able to stick with the game if I wasn't able to rely on like you and Jordan and I'm not trying to single out the other players, but like you guys are vets, and I intentionally brought in some new players. My original desire to run it was I did have these two friends who had never played but just had fallen in love with the game from afar, and I wanted to give them that first experience. But having you, especially, but Jordan and Aaron is great about this too. Just helping me being my co-GMs. It's so nice to be able to, and that might even be a topic we can talk about later on, is having other GMs in games, the pros and cons. But man, it's been such a relief to be able to not have to carry the weight of the rules and feel like I have to be this eternal fountain head of all the rules in the moment. Because when you are that GM, gosh, that just adds so much more challenge to it. You know what I mean? And I haven't had that challenge, and that alone could burn somebody out. This game would have burned out much faster if they were all noobs.
Well, do we have anything else we want to talk about burnout, or we want to move on to our next topic selected by KP?
I'm feeling pretty burnt out on this topic.
There's a lot of good ones in here. A couple of them came up as we were talking.
Yeah, I think whenever we're just chit-chatting, having seen a list, we just kind of gravitate toward the things that are on the list, and because they're in the back of our mind as potential rabbit holes to go down.
Throw us a topic, KP.
I've got a small one that's relevant to what I'm doing right now, which is to say I'm learning it's called the Icon system, used by Last Unicorn Games for their late 90s, early 2000s Star Trek RPGs. I've made a couple of characters. I've been actively going through and making little charts for a DM screen of sorts. And I've been doing some mock scenarios where I try to suss out how difficult things would function in the system. I mean, this system is brand new to me. I've never played anything quite like it. Long story short, I'm doing a lot more work than I ever did learning any other system that I've DM'd.
That's always good.
But anyway, the topic being, have you guys ever encountered a system that has annoying and confusing errors and typos in the player or in the guidebook?
Yes, I did play the older versions of World of Darkness. I played them quite a bit.
I think publishing's getting better, right? And maybe that's just the fact that I only tread in the shallow waters of WotC, and I mean I've been perusing recently other systems, in the back of my head, thinking I'm already kind of starting to think past D&D. I have been pleasantly surprised by the quality of even small publishers. I think even small publishers, and probably just with, probably computers is the big deal. Like when I was playing at my peak before this time was the early 2000s, late 90s, I guess, in my teenage days. And, they were a lot more prevalent the further back you go. But these days, I feel like publishing in general, the quality is really high these days.
Well, if you're publishing now, you have a wealth of playtesters, because where everything starts off as digital content, you can really iron out a lot of those problems by allowing if you're doing a Kickstarter, allowing those people who kickstart to have early access to your materials, and they are your proofers. They are the ones who go through and find the errors, and they see where the problems are in the phrasing of different rules, and find the different little nooks and crannies that lead to confusion about what the hell the author was trying to mean whenever they were describing how something worked. I think that the biggest boon for tabletop RPGs has just been this digital revolution that's been happening for 20 years now, and having access to like literally the internet's worth of people helping them with developing the game. That's where I attribute most of the dramatic increase in quality that we've seen over the past 30 years. Because back in the day, you had to publish a book and go to a convention or something like that, or put it on the shelf in your friendly local gaming shop in order for people to see your content and pick it up and buy it and read it. And it's already in print, and you can't really change things once they're in print as easily as whenever they're just digital documents. Like whenever I fund a Kickstarter, I might get like 5 or 6 different major revisions to the rules before the final product is sent to the printers.
I haven't had that experience yet. Maybe because I'm just such a cheap bastard, but I've never contributed to an RPG Kickstarter sufficient at all. But I might need to go do that. Go find one just to contribute to.
I mean, even for the publishers who I would consider some of the bigger publishers, not necessarily including Wizards of the Coast D&D, because they pre-publish a lot of stuff in their Unearthed Arcana content. So literally years ahead of time, you are getting sneak peeks of some of the content that's going to come out. For instance, in the most recent book, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, there were things that were published in there that had been Unearthed Arcana articles years ago. So they had a lot more play testing, they had a lot more eyes on it, and they had a lot more people giving feedback on how to improve their content. And it's not just Wizards of the Coast that does that. Like literally every publisher that I even tangentially follow, they do similar things.
I have a friend who got in on the 7th Sea Kickstarter years ago and had that experience where he got multiple drafts and things like that. And eventually we played it when he got the final copy. And it was just like what you'd get from Wizards of the Coast as far as quality, as far as typos and stuff like that. They really weren't present. I wasn't a huge fan of the end result game, but it made sense. It worked. It just didn't work for me. But like they accomplished their goal of publishing a consistent, polished product, and the guy was just a self-publisher. He was the original creator of the game who had bought back the rights and then self-published it through Kickstarter. But he was really, if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't like he just kind of redid it himself over the course of years. It was pretty cool.
So, I'm sorry, Kyle, I think you're just kind of up shit's creek because you bought a game that came out 20 years ago.
By a now defunct company. It's okay.
Those are the best, though. Remember those Cyberpunk games, those early Cyberpunk games? Those are classic. Their writing was not awesome.
I think that this book has nailed the material needed to get a casual fan or someone just getting interested in Star Trek up to speed to play in a Star Trek game, and maybe to run one, but in my opinion, and I don't mean to be elitist, but to run a good Star Trek game, I think you need to have been a fan for a while and have seen a decent amount of material, because that's at least something that the Trek from the original series into Voyager kind of had in common, was a solid, pretty tight timeline considering it stretched over 40 years of television. And fans of that era of Trek want that timeline. They want to see little threads and connections going back to, some episode they remember from the second season of Next Gen. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. This is not a Star Trek episode, though we should do another one of those, Clayton. So the book does a good job of introducing someone to the property, which is to say those sections I don't really need. And so what I've done is just read, the meat, I guess. If the lore is the potatoes, I've read the meat. And I've found that when I learn a system, the first thing I really want to do is like go through the guided, because every book pretty much has this, go through the guided make a character portion. And God, this book, it leads you through making a character, and then at the end of that, you realize by reading the additional meat sections that you've done it wrong. And it's not like it's, sequentially in page order. I find myself jumping around all of the time and like going back to the glossary constantly. I sound like I'm totally shitting on this system too. And on the whole, the book is worth my purchase. I would have bought it back in '99 if I would have been aware of it. But it just makes me, actually it makes me appreciate what Dungeons and Dragons does in their, pretty slick way of writing. I'll say that.
Insert appropriate segue here. But I'm like chomping at the bit to talk about one of these topics. Would you guys mind if I kick out another topic?
Go for it. The disco must go on.
There's a lot of good ideas on here I want to get to, but something that our conversations I've been recently having really makes me want to dig into this one. How to role play when a player has the stats to know or do something, but the character doesn't, and that's been a conversation as I've been guiding players through character creation and watching players make the choices that they've been making. That, to me, is the biggest challenge that a role-playing game makes to a player. And when I was a kid, and I think this is probably true for everybody who sits down to their first gaming table, is the appeal to table and top RPGs is you get to live inside the imaginary skin of someone that you're not in a way that no other form of like interactive gaming or fantasy gaming, video gaming, I guess, is probably the only one that comes to mind. But even like passive stuff, like just watching movies about heroes, you don't get the same thing. You don't get to be a hero or a villain, I guess, in any other medium quite like you do in an RPG. But at the same time, you're challenging yourself to be someone else. And I've seen players really struggle with this. What's your all's, how do you guys approach this challenge as a player whenever you're pulling up to a table?
I still have a lot of trouble with separating what I know from what my character knows. I've dealt with that since I started, and I have improved, but I am nowhere near good at always making sure that I don't act on metagame knowledge, because I've read the past several editions of D&D and the monster manual, so I know a good bit about the monsters that are in them because I've been a DM and I've ran those monsters. And when I'm a player, it's a lot harder to think, okay, my character is only 3rd level and they have never encountered a troll before. How would my character react to that? It's really hard not to automatically bring out the fire and the acid whenever you get those, because it's something that has been ingrained into me so much over the years that in D&D you see a troll, you get the fire and the acid. I have encountered this problem personally, and I've seen it as a GM since the very beginning of my career. like one of the first games of Call of Cthulhu I ever ran was set in the year 2000, which was the year in which we were playing. And one of my players at the table knew a lot about computers. And I was the referee, I want to say is the term for Call of Cthulhu. No, keeper is the term for Call of Cthulhu. I was the keeper, and I had presented this problem where there was encrypted information, or not. It wasn't encrypted. It was just behind a password to log onto a person's computer, their personal computer. And so my player just started describing how they circumvent that in real life, but their character really didn't have a lot of computer knowledge. It was entirely something that the player themselves knew how to do, and they could sit and talk me through every step of the way. And if I had a computer in front of me, I could have done exactly what they were telling me, and I would have been able to bypass this problem that I presented to them. So at that point, it feels wrong to ask for a role on how to defeat this problem, because the players at the table, the group knows how to do it. But if I then say, okay, give me a roll, oh, you rolled really low on your computers and you weren't able to do it. Well, what do you mean I wasn't able to do it? I told you exactly how it is done.
That's a sticky situation. And coming at it from that perspective, Clayton, that was another. See, it's the contrast between someone with so much experience like you guys and me, just kind of basically a returned novice to the game. That stuff I find challenging, but as a DM, I feel like I give players a pass in a way for that, because I don't know how you put that out of your mind. And I don't know, I feel like if I want to throw a troll at a party, I think I think I have to just acknowledge that they're going to figure out they can't deal with fire pretty fast, even if they have no way to do it. You know what I mean? And as you've noticed, you're pointed out to me, sometimes I tend to make some difficult and overly difficult encounters at times. I think that might even be one of my biases when I'm making these encounters, is that I'm just assuming that any weaknesses my NPCs have or creatures have, their players are going to know it, and they're going to exploit it perfectly because I have so many knowledgeable players. That stuff doesn't bother me as a GM. This doesn't bother me, but it's something that I think that there's an opportunity out there for a self-publisher to really dig into a game. There has to be a systematic way that hasn't been explored yet to bake in your ability, to figure out a way. There has to be a systematic way to separate through game mechanics what the players themselves of human beings, their potential. I always think about it like this. The one thing that always bugs me is that I love playing wizards, right? And as we all know, a wizard should at least have a 17 intelligence, if not a 16. Well, an 8, if you are lucky enough to have a wizard that rolls an 18 hit points, throw out some ideas. What people from history do you think an 18 intelligence person could be a contemporary with? Albert Einstein, right? Is that not what an 18 intelligence, 19 intelligence looks like?
See, personally, no, I don't think an 18 intelligence is that, because the probabilities of rolling an 18 intelligence, or rolling an 18 in any particular stat, I don't remember what it is for the 4d6 method, because it's the chances are higher of doing it, but under the old second edition 3d6 stats, the chances were approximately 1 in 200 of having an 18 in a particular stat. And I graduated in a class of 200 people. So I had somebody in my class who was probably an 18 intelligence person.
Well, that's a good point. I like thinking about it that way. So looking at it from that vantage point, I know for a fact that I have an average intelligence. Like I know this, and I'm a special education teacher. I know I've been IQ tested. I'm very proud to say I'm an average human being. And that's great because there's a lot of people out there who are not. But I love playing wizards, and I've always wondered, how can I possibly live up to this character? You know, how can I mean, other than just your GM giving you for some reason, the ability to roll a skill check for something with an added bonus, it doesn't it doesn't really adequately impart that, in my opinion, because then you're making, as the DM and as the game goes, you're making everything a check. It's like the only time that your superior skill comes into play is when it's related to an active skill moment. And I've always found that to be very challenging. And on the converse, and I know I'm dominating this conversation, but this is why I chose it, because I had a lot of thoughts on this. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, it also irks me more than metagame stuff whenever a player intentionally builds their character from the perspective of, okay, I'm going to take this dump stat, and I'm going to maybe make wisdom or intelligence a dump stat. And then that player is having to put, I've seen numerous times that a player with a really low charisma always ends up putting themselves out there as the party face because that's just their natural inclination as a player. And when they're doing those, say if they're a very charismatic person, in game they're talking and making cases that are very charismatic. And then me as the DM, I have to check that, forces me to check them with a skill check. But even then, that usually what I've seen players do is they then pivot to the one player who maybe isn't quite so assertive, but does have the appropriate stat, right? So they'll end up doing all the lead in for the party as the face, and then essentially borrow someone else's character sheet when it comes time to roll. For some reason now that irks me. But I don't see how players can help it. I kind of see it as like almost cheating the gaming system, because if you're not actually role playing your character in your character's deficits, then you're kind of getting free points. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and in your particular scenario, that's a dick move to like be the person who comes up with this brilliant plan. I'm intentionally putting air quotes around brilliant because everybody thinks that their plan is brilliant. And then turns to the other player whose character would have the stats to reasonably come up with something like that. I can see it as being the way to handle that situation because all of us are smarter than one of us. And whenever you're playing a group of player characters, there's probably somebody in that group who's going to be smart enough to come up with that conclusion if one of the players is smart enough to do it. The trick in that situation then is, I feel, to get that one player whose character is supposed to have been the one to come up with that solution to be the one to role play that out, actually like informing the other players or role play out the like letting everybody know or executing that particular plan. As long as the initial player isn't being just too domineering at the table, that's an entirely different problem. But if it's everybody just kind of working together and representing their group, but not necessarily representing their character, I kind of see that as a workaround, and it doesn't bother me as much. It only bothers me, like Elliot, when you said, when the one person is the more dominant person at the group, and they are using that as a means to get around their own self-selected terrible stat.
I'm going to jump in. Oh, wait, unless you have more to say, Elliot.
No, go ahead, brother.
I'm going to jump in on that topic here. There's a very good example of exactly what you're talking about in the Firefly game that I'm playing. We have a character who, on paper, is an extremely talented doctor, like general purpose doctor, like with some like research under her belt as a character, and also like worked as a surgeon. So like, very accomplished like healer. But the player, though is a very like science focused person, works in a lab, is not a doctor, and so doesn't really know diddly about like, medication names and whatnot. And we have another player who is an actual working nurse and knows quite a bit about medications and whatnot. And so how it usually works out, although fortunately the roleplay dynamic is good, and so I don't think the person playing the doctor ever feels stepped on, but I'm not sure. But regardless, how it'll usually play out is the player, who is a nurse, even though their character has a little bit of medical stat, but much lower than our doctor character, will describe out, like, kind of for flavor, but also a little bit in person, like in character rather, will describe out exactly what's gonna go down medically. I'm rambling here, but it's an example of how exactly what you were talking about, it could work, and I think it does work. And I think just as long as no one's getting bossed around or stepped on, then everything's kosher.
Yeah, absolutely. That in that situation, I could see someone as a person. Just depends on their personality type, whether or not, kind of like going back to the GM thing. I know a lot of DMs who would be really shackled and feel constrained by like a player like Clayton, frankly, because he knows so much about the game, so much more than I do. I see it as a blessing, whereas other people could see it as like, gosh, get off my turf kind of thing. I've definitely had GMs who would make a ruling in the moment because they don't know the rules and then get corrected and then they get pissed. You know what I mean? I could see the same thing with that player. If that player's cool and they appreciate it, I would appreciate that stuff. If I were the doctor in that situation, I would feel almost more emboldened to be assertive about when to step in, because I knew I had that other player in my back pocket, like, hey, how would you do this? You know what I mean? Like, but I think that stuff's totally kosher with me if your players are cool to each other, and that seems like it would just enhance the game, right? And don't get me wrong, in the games that, like, I use the face because it's the most obvious example, because a lot of people dump stat and charisma and they still end up being put in, I guess, a pseudo leadership role. A lot of times the players who have high charismas, maybe they make a character outside their comfort zone. I've known many players who play bards or maybe rogues or whatever and end up with a pretty high charisma and just aren't comfortable being that person. You know what I mean? And when you have a party with a bunch of shrinking violets with your high charisma stat, oftentimes it's just the more experienced gamer who is put in the position of like, well, there's a bunch of dead air here, so I guess I'll jump in and talk to this NPC, fuck my stats. I try to take that into consideration as DM as well. You know what I mean? I would not to pull the curtain back a little bit on anything specific, but I feel like my game is kind of like that in the Broby game. I think we rely on the experienced players to take the lead, even in situations when their stats aren't necessarily the most ideal, but it's completely understandable. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and like where Jordan's character ends up being the de facto leader, his charisma isn't positive.
He plays it that way.
But he does play it that way, and he kind of wrote his character in that way, where he is this basically long lost lord of an area, and he's kind of being thrust into that lordship role. So, I mean, he's definitely following a character arc that seems baked into his character.
Yeah, I may have made him do that without his permission.
Well, okay.
I think I actually did that to him. But you are right. It did. I mean, that's what I'm saying. In my game is a good example of it, but it's not the example I'm thinking of it, because the game has naturally, it bends towards that way. That's one of the things I really like about the game, is that I have people out of their area of expertise doing things, because then I can kind of fuck with them. But that's either here nor there.
So, is it time for me to select another one? I think we've got enough time. Or do one of you have one? Because we probably have enough time for one more topic. Do you guys have another one that's just burning that you want to talk about?
No, the only thing burning is the fucking boogie oogie disco dance floor of this Dicebag, my dude.
I will say I don't have a preference, but I can say I'm looking it over, and I really think that I could probably talk a lot about the monomyth idea, but it's something I'm living right now, and I think that if I give him my druthers, I'd like to talk about that.
Sure, let's talk about Joseph Campbell and the hero with 1,000 faces and the heroic journey and all that. In the
You want
next
to intro
15,
the
20
idea
minutes.
for those people who aren't familiar with the concept?
So, very basically, Joseph Campbell was I don't remember exactly what his specialty was, but
Psychologist. He was a 2 steps away from Sigmund Freud. He was I think Carl Jung's understudy.
okay. So, back in the first half of the 1900s, he did a bunch of research basically in history and stories and myths, and basically came up with this this idea that pretty much every story that has ever been told conforms to this one overarching narrative that he called the hero's journey. And this hero's journey has certain parts to it that happen, and if you want to know beat for beat what those points are, go watch Star Wars: A New Hope, because that movie does every single major beat of the hero's journey right on time.
Because he was a student of Joseph Campbell. Did you know that? George Lucas.
So my point with the hero's journey, and also called the monomyth, is that in role-playing games, because this is a collaborative story that is emerging from the interaction of the players at the table, I don't think it's really conducive to playing characters. The game master can use it for ideas, but when it comes down to the dice rolls, it's just too possible that a bad set of dice rolls will completely fuck up the story. Using the
Hero with 1,000 faces, right?
Yeah, the hero of the 1,000 faces, the hero's journey as the template for your campaign is fraught with danger, because you might just screw everything up, because players don't play to that idea. If you just had the game master who was plotting everything out, it could work. But whenever you throw in other people, and when you throw in the dice making decisions, you cannot have the hero's journey in a predictable way, because there's just too much randomness. There's too much that's going to happen that throws it off. It will end up being unsatisfying because it doesn't conform to what people expect.
It takes him out of the spotlight, because the hero journey, it by definition, like, focuses in on an individual's tale. You're the hero, and role-playing games are unique because it's an ensemble. It's hard to really accomplish the hero's journey from the DM imposing it, because no one person gets to feel completely on top of whenever the resolution comes. It's Han Solo supported Luke Skywalker, and Leia supported Luke Skywalker, and all that stuff, but ultimately it was Luke's path. And when you try to play it write it as a DM, in my experience, those as a player can be the least fun, because you're on a string. And me as a player, I personally, and maybe other people are different, I mean, if the story's really good, that helps, but I still chafe under a DM who wants me to get ultimately to one particular place, which is funny, because as a DM, I always want my players to get to a single place, which is one of those weird contradictions, I think, with when you put your GM hat on versus when you put your player hat on.
Another thing is that, like, whenever you're game mastering a game, whenever you're writing a story, whenever you're writing this stuff, whenever you're creating this stuff by yourself, you can move these things around. You can move around the part where the hero leaves his humble beginnings and learns about the greater world. You can move around the part where they descend into the underworld, where they go into the basically when shit starts getting real and they start facing problems. you can move those plot points around. But whenever it comes to the plot point of the hero gets the setback or the hero gets defeated, player characters are like, fuck that. I'm going to do literally everything in my power to win here. And if I win or if I lose, well, that is so railroading. How dare you determine that I'm going to fail at this particular point?
So true.
In my opinion, as a DM, it's not your job to decide the hero's journey. It's not your job to decide anything about your player's personal journey. It's your job to create a living world. It's your job to facilitate the journey the players want to go on, and sometimes the journey they don't know they want to go on. So I'm not trying to say, anarchy in the streets, no gods, no masters, the players rule everything. By any means, I'm not trying to say that. But I think that you're gonna, as a game master, you're gonna find more inspiration in something like the Canterbury Tales or like historical heroic archetypes, stuff like that, to build your world.
See, that's something that I'm growing into as a DM. I'm so glad you mentioned that, KP, because just to make sure I have it right in my head, the Canterbury Tales are just a bunch of discrete stories, like a collection. Right? It's been a long time since I studied the
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit in a prior podcast, but like, I think that new DMs or GMs who are motivated by telling their own story, they sit down like they're writing a novel, and that's how they kind of that's kind of how they plot out their game, and that's very much how I'm set it's my default setting for writing a game. But we recently, back in December, we finished up and defeated Strahd, which is a perfect example of, I think, what we're getting at here. You have an ultimate end goal, and yeah, it didn't follow it perfectly, but you had obscure heroes wandering into a land where they're completely outmatched, and they grow and grow and grow, and they grow through trials, and then eventually they defeat the big bad, and that's what happened. Well, I struggled with what to do next, and I've been kind of kicking the can around and riffing off and building off of plots you guys are kind of creating organically. And I'm finding that, like, just from player feedback privately, I'm getting the impression that that my players at the table, really are enjoying this more. Like, I feel like I'm delaying, like I'm kind of being a bit hesitant, or like I'm not really giving you guys much. But I get the sense that you guys are enjoying the game as much, if not more, than since Strahd's passed, because that's how the game is going now. It's more like a collection of, what are you guys interested in? I put a menu of things, in front of y'all. And then, even a few of the things we've done the last couple games have been just totally accidental, that I've had to make up on the fly. And it's eaten a bunch of game time, but you guys are choosing it, you know what I mean? It's no longer me feeding it to you. You guys are creating the content. And that has its own problems, but it's been refreshing to see that work. Because that's my biggest fear in games like that. It's like, how do you actually make that work? It seems like that's a recipe for disaster, you know what I mean? Letting them go in any direction. But so far, it's working.
Yeah, and you've been handling it very, very well. I love the fact that our most recent our most recent session last Sunday, I kind of got the feeling that nearly all of that was just improv on your part, and you did a phenomenal job with it, and I had fun the entire session. And having been on the GM side of the screen whenever something similar has happened, oh my god, that is exhausting. I imagine that you were just happy to be able to stop talking and just take a breather after the session was done.
I've been lucky, but yeah, I mean, pretty much. It's been kind of like, and I think, KP, this is something I've struggled with, and I'd love to know how you play in Discord, which tells me that it's pretty much theater of the mind. When I decided to run a game, I wanted to really, I had been playing in a game where the DM just used physical objects. He used terrain at it, and it was one of the most enjoyable games I've ever played in, mainly because he did so much crafting. And I wanted to give that same sort of feel by prepping content in Roll20. And I'm realizing now that just how appropriate and necessary it is to, I mean, sometimes you just got to let go, man, and go back to theater of the mind. How is playing in the COVID Discord RPG era, do you run primarily in the theater of the mind, and is it working out okay?
I wanna walk back what I said just a smidge about the hero's journey, and it will transition into answering your question, I swear. I find a great amount of value in things like the hero's journey, and in actually to be, less pedantic, like any other piece of media that tells a story that you enjoy. Because primarily, your job as a game master is to be a soothsayer making sense out of all the guts and chaos, both of the rulebook and also of the actions of your players, muddling up the story and world that you've so lovingly over-prepared to create. And in that regard, when the players encounter a setback through natural poor decision-making or poor dice rolls, you, the game master, can use that and turn that and twist that and read that into an amazing opportunity to bring in some of that hero's journey type stuff. I guess I hadn't been thinking about it from the perspective of a brand new DM, but I don't want to discourage someone from that very classic, this idea of the monomyth and have them disregarded entirely. And on the note of playing in Discord and Theater of the Mind, I prefer Theater of the Mind anyway because it allows me to kind of be that soothsayer, to be that fortune teller, and just interpret things. And I like that so much more than having things on a grid, because I find that it just locks you into a piece of graph paper. But I think I'm in the minority, at least amongst my friends. A lot of people.
If Jordan were here, I think he's very much that preference.
Well, and even the high schoolers that I was running a game for in person before my my after-school program went remote, even they really liked having that grid with figures to move around and to look at. I don't know, I think that I'm just in the minority there, but maybe I'm not. Regardless, when playing over Discord, I've found that it becomes actually a lot like podcasting. I use push to talk. Not everybody does. But when I speak, I'm saying something intentional. I have something to say, and I push control on my keyboard, and I say it, and then I let control go of my keyboard. And now I've let, metaphorical control go to whatever it is that my players or my fellow, if I'm running a game, or my party members, if I'm playing a game, what they're going to say, and I listen, and it doesn't always work. You get a lot of people who don't, new to hanging out with people or running games or playing games over Discord. You get a lot of stepping on toes, people talking over quieter people. But once that kind of stuff irons out, it becomes this intentional handing off of the torch that sometimes, well, maybe more than just sometimes, fairly frequently, that passing of the talking stick wouldn't happen in my in-person games as much. We would get people who would just kind of quietly sit back. I don't know, does that answer your question?
No, yeah, I mean, because the reason why I even asked it in the first place, because I was thinking, well, that question seems almost kind of only adjacent to this. The reason why I made that connection to this topic is that, the difference between the hero, as a GM making a game, if you're trying to emulate a very linear hero's path, kind of like march towards ultimate heroism, reaching a pinnacle, well, you have, as a DM, you then start to create that path, right? And it's easier. I think it kind of lends itself towards, okay, well, today they're going to go to this castle, so I'm going to grid it out, and that's where we're going today. And then if the players don't go there, you make them. You know what I mean? Whereas if you play the more episodic, I've found it's difficult to give players a menu of choices, or maybe I think of it in terms of like a menu of small goals, or allow them the freedom or encourage them. There's a difference between allowing someone, because as a GM, you should never completely overrule a player, but encouraging players to just go wherever. That necessitates improv, which obviously at that point there's some tricks you can work in to have things gridded out and whatever, but then you're just kind of shoehorning a little bit. But at the same, I guess what I'm saying is the challenge when you give the players too much of the reins is that it's very difficult to just improv a decent combat. I guess that's what I'm getting at. And if you're not thinking ahead of time and think about game balance, you're either going to make an encounter that's too easy, or you're going to make an encounter that's too hard. And so if you're always letting the players just go wherever, they're either never getting into combat, which is okay, but it also kind of, to me, it can bog the game down in trivia, trivial things. There's a tightrope to it, but I think dedicating down, when a GM dedicates down to, this is my story, this is how they're going to be heroes, damn it, so let's walk that path. That's my natural inclination, and this game has been a lesson in just letting go of that, and letting the players be in control. And it's challenging, but it's more fun.
I have found that it is in the trivia that I discover who my character actually is. Doing these big adventures, I don't really get a good feel for who my character is. It's when my character isn't being a big damn hero, when it's their time off, when it's their vacation, when it's their weekend, that's when I find out who that character really is. Or when I'm just like my character sitting around the fire at the end of a day's long journey and just shooting the shit with the other companions, just talking about whatever. Those are the times when my character really shines.
And I know I've talked a lot just in general, but can I give a really good example of what I think puts a pin in your exact statement? Why it can be so fun. I'll reveal a complete screw up that I made that led to a tangent storyline that now is going to be like a really fun part of the game I'm enjoying working on. Is that there was a character who had to be, and feel free to cut this out if you can, if it gives too much of an example, but I'm going to use you as an example if that's okay. There's a spell that determines whether or not a player is, whether or not someone's guilty of murder if you cut off their hand. And a player used that, and as a GM, I just got it backwards. So when it came time to read, I had it in my head that this character was stone cold guilty. And whenever the result that's supposed to actually show whether or not they're guilty or not came up, I, as a DM, played it wrong. And so what happened was, even though Jordan had cast Zone of Truth, the murderer, quote unquote, had made his save. And so in my mind, it allowed him to lie. And so he said, no, I didn't kill this guy. But the two witnesses had not made their saves. So they said, yes, he did. And so Jordan knew that those two people 100% saw this guy kill them, but he's saying no. But then when the spell was cast, the spell proved him innocent. But I had intended to go ahead and play it off like he was guilty. So I shoot a message to the player like, hey, did I play that right? And it was you. You were like, no. And I'm like, oh shoot, what do I do? Well, so now I've been able to create, it's been 2 sessions ago and it's been kind of playing off in the background, but I've been creating a quest now that explains why that works. And it's fun. A lot more fun than, it's a lot more fun than just, oh yeah, he was guilty and that's it, and I think that if you are the type of GM that really likes to plot out every little detail in every direction, those types of moments don't happen.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop right now. We'll go on to geek things. I have just one, or actually, no, I have two. The first one is a movie that came out a couple years ago by Taika Waititi, the same guy who directed Thor Ragnarok and also directed What We Do in the Shadows. He has a movie came out a couple years ago called Hunt for the Wilder People, and it is on Netflix now. And I watched it and loved it. It's set in New Zealand, so I got to brush up on my New Zealander accent. Got to hear some people talking with a New Zealander accent, so it kind of reinforced my my character Wade in our Strahd game for how he needs to be talking. The other geek thing that I have is on YouTube, a 2-part documentary series by the YouTube channel In the Praise of Shadows. It is the golden age of horror comics. This is, when you put the 2 parts together, it is a 3-hour documentary on horror comics, their rise, their fall, and their of late kind of resurgence in popularity. Absolutely fascinating. I love that comic books. I love horror. It was right down my alley, and I'm probably going to be watching a lot more of the documentaries on that YouTube channel.
What decade would the Golden Age have been? I'm not familiar with that at all.
In the 1950s, up until The Seduction of the Innocents was published and the Comics Code Authority was put into place. So basically up until then was the golden age of horror comics.
So they censored them away pretty much.
Basically, yes.
Well, I have one. I've been really anxious about the Dune movie that's supposed to be coming out later this year. I'm a huge fan of the Dune mythology, Dune worlds. I've read the first book and, kind of flirted on YouTube with summaries of the others. I just love the world and the world building. I'm not a huge fan of 900-page books, so I can't say I've read them all, but I'm trying. And I'm also a huge fan of the movie from the 80s, the David Lynch film. And the other day, I noticed a documentary called Jodorowsky's Dune. It's a Netflix documentary, and it tells the story of a previous attempt to make Dune. I believe it was in the late 70s by a director whose last name was Jodorowsky. And he assembled a who's who once he got the rights to make Dune. And if you watch the trailer, he describes his desire to make a movie that made you feel like you were on acid, even though you weren't on acid. That was his goal. And so he assembled H.R. Geiger, who would later on go do so much great work in Alien. And he built a team of artists that weren't necessarily in the movie industry. And they set about creating the most elaborate and beautiful storyboards and set design. And they had made, everything was on paper. They'd scripted it out. They drew it out, the whole thing. They had detailed character pictures. They even had it casted. They had Orson Welles going to play the Baron Harkonnen. They had Salvador Dali agreed to play the Emperor Carino. And the storyboards are fucking wild. And when they took it to the movies or to the studios, they were like, "Oh no, we're not making this movie anymore. That would cost like $100 million. Not doing that." And they never made the movie, and it never got successfully. It just got killed. And what's cool about it is not only that it was just this great, beautiful thing, but then a lot of the team that was assembled for this movie went on to be recruited by the David Lynch film to a certain extent, by Blade Runner, by Alien, because people had seen this beautiful movie and they wanted to steal parts of it. So even though the movie never got made, it went on to ultimately, I think it's like without it, Alien wouldn't have gotten made. The team that made Blade Runner wouldn't have been made. And so many great movies were born out of that movie that never got made that nobody even knows about. It's just a cool documentary. Any fan of Dune or sci-fi, it's a great watch.
Also a big fan of Dune. That sounds really cool to hear. Good one to bring up for sure. Mine, I guess, is the end of at least twice, I believe, on this podcast, where I've mentioned the year 2000 masterpiece video game Deus Ex. I beat it. I finally beat it just a few weeks ago. And, man, totally worth it. It has become my favorite game of all time. The best way to describe that game is it's simple. It's a little old school compared to like flashy RPGs like, certainly Cyberpunk, but Skyrim, really popular role-playing video game. And in its simplicity, it becomes more like a board game where everything you do, it has a discrete purpose and set of expectations, and it fits within a large toolkit that you can draw from to solve a problem in the game. And the game has so many different ways to solve problems, so many different routes to explore, multiple endings, of course. And with the exception of the PS20, fuck that gun, and it's kind of a running gag amongst Deus Ex fans, there's nothing in the game that feels pointless or useless. I encourage you to try for a non-lethal playthrough. You get a lot of joy, a lot of good difficulty, very fair, challenging difficulty out of doing that. And the story of it is just a cyberpunk wonderland. It's, pre 9/11 conspiracy theory coupled in with the Matrix meets, dystopian future, some of which we're seeing right now. It's just really cool. I can't recommend it enough, and I'm really glad that I finally beat it. Over the past 15 years, I'd had two failed attempts at beating it. I just kind of quit playing it for no particular reason, and then this time I stuck with it, and I'm really glad that I did.
I'm that way with Fallout 4. I've never beat Fallout 4, but I've probably put at least 200 hours in the game.
I believe that my Deus Ex playthrough, doing, like everything I could have possibly wanted to do, I'm probably sitting at 80 hours in a run, and then I've got probably 100 hours in the game because I did 20 hours of, dicking around or playing for a while and then reloading because I realized I wanted to do something different. That's a great feeling to beat any RPG video game where you've got just tens of hours, if not hundreds, involved.
Especially the old school ones that were much longer back in the day. All right, guys, what do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it. Good talk.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.